Keeping up with technology isn't easy, especially in higher education. You need to make sure everything is aligned, connected, and secure. You have to keep your eye on the big picture, the success of the student. Having the right technology is a great start, but that's not enough. You need someone by your side who understands how to connect the dots. Someone who asks the right questions so you don't solve the wrong problems. A partner that can identify opportunities and turn them into accomplishments and find the student success you are aiming for all along. Imagine that.
Okay, I want to welcome you to my session today. I presented at the Community College of Appalachian conferences before. The last time I presented, I was in a room full of people. Today, I'm sitting in the library at Northeast State Community College on a very nice spring-like day, and I'm looking out over the mountains, which I'm imagining to be my audience. So I hope you'll enjoy this presentation. As you can see on the screen, I'm an associate professor of history and humanities at Northeast State Community College, which is located in the northeast segment of Tennessee, in the Tri-Cities area of Bristol, Kingsport, and Johnson City. And of course, I've been at Northeast State Community College since 2002 as a full-time professor. I started out as pretty much online. That was back in the days before there was YouTube or any kind of social media, online learning and teaching. At that time, it was pretty static. There was not a lot of interactivity. So I've had a lot of experience with this. And I know during our present situation with COVID, we are teaching a variety of ways. This semester, I'm teaching mostly hybrid classes that meet once a week. So we're very used to adapting our styles to various sorts of things. And so this presentation today will be talking about ways of thinking about history. I know when I was a history student back in my early days in public school, high school, and then college, I was not a real fan of most of the history classes I took. I loved history, but history at that time was a linear narrative. You started with one year, and you went to the next. When you took American history classes, you started with early settlement, went to 1877, and then the second part of that history was 1877 to the present. We still maintain that. I found that that's not a very effective way to think about history. We're going to look at that a little bit. But it is a linear narrative. I'm not saying it's not, but it's also, I think the most important thing is we think of it as webs of possibilities. There's more than one way to think about history. So we're going to be looking at a variety of perspectives today that I hope will enable you to kind of think about history in different ways. So let's begin. Start out with a theoretical background. I think that's a good way to start, and then we'll later on move into the practice part. I like quotes. I use quotes with my class quite a bit. These are good ways to kind of start discussions, to start conversations. And I want to think about this presentation today as a conversation, even though you're not able to talk back to me at this point. But I want it to be a conversation, very conversational, rather than just scripted, where I just read from the script all the time. This is from a book about history, but it's about jazz history, history of jazz music, which I like, by Dave Chennon. I put the picture up, so if you want to get the book, I would encourage you to get it. He talks about the history of jazz and how history of jazz has been thought of. And he says the story of history is not just a linear narrative, but it's a network of possibilities. In my title, I use the word web, but it doesn't really matter. So when I read his chapter on this, it really began to change my way of thinking about history. And I've adopted many of his ideas and conceptions in my class. I'm a musician myself, and I like to think of my class as a band. Each person is playing a different instrument, and it all comes together somewhere at the end. So So let's keep this in mind as we go through the rest of our presentation. Another quote that I think is particularly applicable to the Appalachian region, or it's applicable anywhere. The study of history is really the product of a place. I know that I live in Appalachia now. I went to Appalachian State University when I got my degree, and I grew up in a little town in Appalachia. And I've always known that where you grow up and the type of experiences that you have has a lot to do with the way you perceive things. And history is never experienced in a way other than local. We always experience history from where we are. Our perception of it, even large events like the Second World War or 9/11 or even the pandemic that we're going through now is not a universal experience, it's a personal experience. And I do think that history is the product of a place. And the first place we're going to visit is right here. Now, when all of you look at these pictures, of course, the sign kind of gives it away. It's a motel and a restaurant. Most of you will probably see this as a motel. You might remember the times that you traveled and stayed in motels. You may have particular memories of certain types of motels, the trips you were on. And everyone that's watching this presentation today will have a different set of memories associated with this. These are connections. So, but none of you are going to be looking at it as Kelly's Motel, except for the sign, but that probably doesn't mean a great deal to you. For me, this was my home for 19 years. And so when I look at this picture, I see it in a personal way. This is the product of a place, and it made me in many ways who I am today. So when I look at the picture, I overlay it with some memories and connections that probably none of you would do. And here they are. Starting at the top, this is a picture of my dad, whose name was Paul Kelly. I do have many pictures of him and my mother. We lived at the motel. My dad, it was the first motel in Allegheny County, North Carolina. Allegheny County is nestled there between Virginia and it's right on the Virginia line, right on the Blue Ridge Parkway, very close to Boone, North Carolina. And this is a picture of my dad. These two pictures I have here are postcards, and I think they're the only two cards that were made of our motel at the time. This was made like in the middle of the 50s. He built this motel in the late 40s. Of course, we got a sign, and this is another view of the motel down at the bottom. This motel is located in Sparta, North Carolina, which is something none of you probably would have been able to know unless you'd stayed there at some point. This motel no longer exists. You can't go and visit it anymore. It's just a field. It's gone back to the way it was before it was built. It makes it kind of ironic. But the overlays that I put over this, there's several things I want to talk about here. The one at the top left is Hammond, Oregon. I became a musician because my parents wanted to see if I could play music. I started with the guitar. I didn't get very far with that, but they rented me a Hammond organ because they had a friend who played the Hammond organ. They thought it'd be neat if I would play. Well, that changed my whole life. It really did. It set me on the road that I am today. I consider myself as a musician first and a historian second, and it's very much tied together. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 65, you may wonder, well, that has to do with it. Well, this was a segregated motel, like most of the facilities were, up until the mid-60s. And I loved my parents dearly, but I had several pretty heated arguments about this topic. And so when I think of the Motel 2, I think about the way it shaped my perception of civil rights. And it really did have a tremendous impact on me. And I think I would have gone in a different direction had I not lived here and had to think about and argue about those issues. The name Tim Holt may not mean very much to you, but he was a Hollywood actor who became famous in his later acting career as a Western actor. He was a cowboy actor. But he appeared in movies like the Citizen Kane movie by Orson Welles. He appeared in The Magnificent magnificent Amberson and the treasurer Sierra Madre, Humphrey Bogart. And the way he's connected to the motel, when I was about 5 years old, he came to the theater in town. We had one movie theater, and they were showing one of his Westerns, and he stayed with us for about 4 or 5 days. And I have pictures of him holding me in his arms and leading me around. Of course, at that time, Orson Welles didn't mean anything to me. But when I look back now, I think, hey, the guy who was one of the stars of Citizen Kane, Magnificent Ambersons, at one time helped me. That was interesting. We had a TV lounge. In fact, we had one of the first, when we had the television, opportunity to have a television, we were one of the first people in town to have a TV. My dad did not want to put them in rooms because, number one, it was expensive. He had to maintain them, and they could be loud and distract other people. So he took a room and converted one of the rooms into a TV lounge. And I remember watching a lot of TV when I was growing up in our apartment where we did have a TV. And one of the most vivid memories was watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. We also had a jukebox, and I learned a lot about music from that time because Dad bought the jukebox, and he didn't have to lease records from a company if you leased it. So he filled that jukebox with things I never would have heard when I was growing up. A lot of big band stuff, easy listening. He was not a rock and roll fan, but I listened to rock and roll in my room all the time. But this shaped my interest in music along with the organ. And Bob Dowden, who was a congressman, I vaguely remember him. He was in the late 90s. He lived very close to Sparta. And he had the distinction of being the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee during the New Deal. And so he worked very closely with FDR. He always referred to him as Franklin. He said, well, the last time I talked to Franklin, because this was long after Franklin Roosevelt died, but he always referred to him as Franklin. And Bob Dowden was instrumental in getting the Blue Ridge Parkway sent through the area. There's a Dowden Park on the parkway named after him. And conveniently, the parkway was really close to his home. So when I look at this picture, I think of all these connections to history that make this a personal encounter with me, a personal experience. And so the way I think about history, I want my students to also think of history as a web of possibilities rather than just a linear narrative. I mean, when I look at this picture, it's more than just the fact that it was built in 1949, we sold it in 1975. It's not facts and dates to me, it's connections. Here's another quote that really changed my mind about things. Very famous fellow who's written a lot of books in American history. Nobody ever lived in the past. And if you think about that, it really makes a lot of sense. Everyone always lived in the present. So when you study history, you're not studying the past, you're studying the present. It was someone else's present, granted. But when you think of history as the study of the past, it does not become alive. It seems dull and boring. So no one ever lived in the past. I did not live at Kelly's Motel in the past. I lived there in my present. And I still think about it in the present. So we always think about history where we are. It's the place we are, and it's also, we think about it in the present. So this is a quote that I think is very important. Here's another series of quotes, and we're going to look at some other things in a minute. We are story. History is the story we tell about the past, that some people have said. I love this quote up here. We are stories contained within this, the complicated centimeters behind our eyes. Our stories come from our brains. So in that sense, history is biology. I have students constantly telling me, well, why do I have to take history? Because I'm a biology major, I'm a nursing major. I say history is biology because we are biological creatures. The fact that we have a certain type of anatomy, physiology, determines how we use our tools. We wouldn't be able to write, we wouldn't be able to use computers and things like that were we not constructed in a certain way. And certainly now, during the pandemic, we're more aware, I think, than ever that history is biology and neurology, I'd say, the brain. And this next quote by the Italian poet, we are a combination of experiences, information, books, we're an inventory of objects. I think that's very important because I do talk about optics in my history class as being very significant. We always have different meanings to those objects, series of styles, and everything can be constantly reshuffled and reordered in every conceivable way. And I love this next book. Think of our lives and tell us in your particularized world, can you make up a story? Now, you don't make up a story that is fictitious. Now, you can if you're a fictional writer like her, but we live in a particularized world. We're really incapable of thinking somehow outside our brains because we experience the world in there, and it's a particular world. So one of the things I want to do is not only think about history, it's not entirely, going from one day to the next, a linear narrative, but I want to think about it. It's how we look at it in particular ways that make it meaningful to us, just like I looked at the picture of where I grew up. I see it in different ways other than you. So these are, I like to use quotes in my class. I think it makes me think about things. Plus, I love books, and I think books, and I like film too. I like music, all of this stuff. But these are some of the books I want to recommend to you. This is a book, Rethinking Consciousness. We don't understand how the brain works exactly, but we do know a lot about how we think it works. And this book really made me rethink things. I think the title is very apt. And let's go back to the picture of my motel again. What he talks about in this book is an attention schema. It's his theory that when the brain perceives something, it does it in two different ways. There is an overt perception, which is the first picture I showed you of a motel. You see it as a motel. That's pretty obvious. I think most people who would look at that picture see it as a motel. That's an objective observation. But the most important thing, I think, is the covert part. That's the subjective part. That's what I see when I look at it. And when you look at the picture, you have your own thoughts about it that you bring to the table. And I think that this is quote too, when that ethereal mental essence that we don't really know exactly what that is, takes hold of an item. It could be a picture, it could be a memory, it could be a piece of music, a movie, or something you've read. It has the property of making the item clear to you, real to you, and vividly present. That's what no one ever lived in the past. We always make things present. In other words, it turns the item into an experience. So that's the part that I really have brought into my class. History is an experience, and we co-create. We are co-creators with musicians, artists, and other people. When we read about something or experience history personally or through, a textbook or something, we kind of are co-creators of that experience because we bring you unique things to it. I think that's pretty good. There's another book about the science of transforming how we learn, and it's about looking into the brain. So it's neurology. So history is biology and neurology. And one thing I've come to understand that every student in our class, whether it's online or whether it's in person or whatever, experiences our class as a different class. There's no two people in that room that's going to have the same learning experience. We like to think that we're in front of a class and we're telling them things, and everybody's absorbing it the same way, but that's simply not true. Everyone is bringing this attention schema with them because it's carried with them. They may be carrying their phone in their pocket, but they've got their brains in their head, and they see things differently. And I want to take advantage of that. I want to understand that students are experiencing class in a different way. And this book, Grasp, mentions, the calculus professor at MIT, Woody Flowers. And I paraphrased his statement that he always told his students, you take history and you substitute calculus. He was talking about calculus. But I apply it to my class. And I tell my students every semester, in this class, we're not learning history, but learning how to think using history as a tool. And I think that really changes your perception about what you're doing in the classroom. You can take anything that you're teaching or your faculty are teaching and substitute for the word history. We're not learning math, but we're learning how to think using math as a tool. biology, but we're learning how to think using biology too. And I think that is so important. It's just a different way of thinking, and that's really what I guess the central point, I guess, of what I'm talking about today is probably that. So think about that and read this book. It's really going back to the motel picture again. This has something to do with my motel, but every day when I go out for lunch to a certain place I like to go, past North Beach State, I pass this quarry, and the highway I travel is up on the top of the field next to the billboard, and I passed it lots and lots of times. But one day I was passing it right before my class, and I was thinking with my mind, I said, that quarry is what history is. So I pulled off the road, I went down to the road in front of the quarry, and I took this picture. And what it shows to me is that history really is two things. It's the transformation of the landscape, or the alteration. It also can be the destruction of the landscape. But it's the creation or the altercation or destruction of the landscape. If you look at history, history is the story of human beings who go in and alter the world they live in various ways. They can alter it in a mental way by writing literature, doing philosophy or whatever, or they can do it in a physical way like this. They build buildings, they write music, and we also engage in wars and things of that nature. But we alter it. We have a pandemic. We try to develop a vaccine to alter that particular landscape. So I put this picture back in my class. I said, I think this is history, but history is not only just that, but it's the objects we produce, which can be a mental object or a physical object, to alter the landscape. So just looking at something you see every day and looking at it in a different way can make a lot of difference. So I brought this into the classroom. And actually the barbed wire in the foreground, I had a student one time that did a project on barbed wire and how it has influenced history and changed history. So there's a lot of topics that can grow out of this particular picture. We'll talk about that in just a second. Also, every spring I do an academic audit, which is something we do in the state of Tennessee, and the school does a self-study. And at Chattanooga State Community College, which is part of the CCA network, of course, last spring, just before the pandemic hit, just before they shut everything down, I was fortunate to be in person there at the motorcycle maintenance program they have. So as a historian, I've audited, history programs, but I told the people that do this, I don't want to do that anymore. Send me somewhere to something that gets me totally out of my comfort zone. So I went to the motorcycle maintenance program, and we had the opportunity to tour their thing. So I came back with this picture, told my students, I want our classes to be like this. And they got really excited to pick the people like motorcycles. They thought I was going to bring a motorcycle into class. But no, I want the class to be like this. I want us to look at history the way these people are looking at the motorcycle, as a set of problems, as webs of possibilities. It's not just a narrative. It's a personal encounter with something, and we're doing something. So this has become my model. We just built a new tech building here at Northeast State that has some of the wonderful stuff to look at. We have a lot of technology in there, as you can imagine. And that's what I want my history classes to be like. I want them to be labs of learning. So I like this picture. Now let's look at some practice. We've talked about theory, so let's look at what all this means. I have a card game I bring into class called Brain Spin, and this is just a picture of what it looks like. You've probably seen it. But, before the COVID era, I would pass the card out to each group. We have groups of 3. I have hybrid classes now, but we really can't meet in small groups. But we still do this activity. You can also do it online, but it's more fun in person. And I ask, the group or individual to look at this and try to list as many things as they can to describe what it is. Now, take the one that looks like a circle. It is a circle. I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that that's a circle, or the one next to it is a circle with 2 lines. So that's the overt part. That's the objective part of the attention schema. But the fun part comes when you start talking about the subjective or the covert part. That circle can be a doorknob, it can be a vinyl record, which start coming back now. It can be a hole, it can be a manhole cover, a headlight, it can be a top of a hat, it can just be numbers of things. And this is the kind of icebreaker activity I do to get students into this idea of looking at history as webs of possibilities. We start out with established facts and dates. We don't make those up. We don't, create those. But we interpret those and we look at them from different perspectives, just like we looked at the motel. So I think that this is a fun game. If you're looking for something interesting to, and you can do this online, you can put these up and let people see the pictures here, and then ask them to describe what they are doing. If you have a Zoom meeting or something, that will work well. The other thing I do is talking about evocative objects, and here's a book I think everybody should have. Evocative objects are what history are, and evocative objects are things we look at and we associate with certain types of emotions and responses. So I give an assignment. This actually is a discussion to get students to think about how history is an encounter with evocative objects and how the covert part of their brain works. Do something you own that has special meaning for your life and explain why you chose it. In what ways is your chosen object evocative? And we can talk about the meaning of the word evocative. Explain how your chosen object could lead to a project topic. Now, my classes are based on projects. I don't give traditional testing, things like that. But students engage themselves in projects, and projects grow out of their encounters with various things. Assignments or this type of assignment. And reply in a thought-provoking way to at least 3 other student posts. So when you think of, I've had students that have talked about their musical instruments. I had a student who talked about a ring that he had that belonged to her sister who died in a tragic accident. So that had a very evocative meaning, but it also caused her to think about something that all of us would look at and say, well, that's just a ring. I have 100 of those. For her, it was not just a ring. It was something that she had a personal encounter with. And I think these kind of exercises are very important, but you might want to consider doing that. This is an outline, I guess you could call it a rubric for a project. And I usually have to do at least 3 of these. They can be done in various formats. It can be a podcast. It can be a traditional essay. It can be an actually created project. We'll write a song or something, or a poem. You can do a number of things, create a video. But no matter how you do it, you have to pick a topic, and you have to deal with these types of questions. What are the takeaways you have as a result? What do you think that you learned from doing research about this? It could be something you're real familiar with, but you didn't know very much about it. What 3 specific connections? Those are the covert things. How does it relate to you? It could be something from 100 years ago or 500 years ago, but there is a way that you think about it today. It stirs things up. I have a module in my course called, it's a series of quotes in the possibility section. I think it's up to 60 quotes now, some of them like the quote you just saw. And they have to talk about one of those that best relates to the project. And I'm very, very strong believer in questions. We learn by asking questions. So if you do a thought-provoking question about what you just did, then I think you've understood what you just did. I mean, what kind of question would you ask yourself about if you want to do more? But what's the question you would ask someone? And of course, we do have sources that have decided it's for. In my classes, I don't use a paid textbook, but I use OER, Open Resource Textbook, and I use crash course videos, which I think are marvelous. And so students do have embedded in their course, fairly well, I wouldn't say called crash course educational, but it's much better than any textbook I ever had. And it is a resource, but I want students to go well beyond that because, they have a library in their pocket. So this is what we do. This is an example of an exercise I use very often. I will go picture And this goes back to the overt and covert, or picture of the motel. And we have a picture from the late 40s or middle 40s of a drive-in theater. Every student, and again, the students get younger and younger. There's parts of the world they do not have any experience with at all. But fortunately, in this area, there are two theaters that are still open, two drive-in theaters. So most students would say, yeah, that is the drive-in theater. That's the overt part. And that's also what some people call inside out. That is your brain, and it sounds like, the Disney movie. I think it's great. But your brain goes inside itself out to the world and looks at it. And that is the objective experience. But then the covert part, it takes that image and brings it back into itself. And that's where it thinks about it and creates things. So I have students look at this, and I say, as we develop our next project or something, how many project ideas do you find that could grow out of this picture? And we discussed the context when it was done. So here's some ideas that they've come up with. We could do a project on the history of automobiles. We could do a project on a specific automobile. We could talk about, the automotive history that goes well beyond just this picture. We could do a topic on movies because they were watching the movie. It's also a topic on gender. This front seat, this a couple. We can talk about the role of men and women, and beyond that, even the role of transgender in our society, things of that nature. How has gender changed its definitions over the years? I had a student that did a project on dating customs. The concept of race, I had a student that said, I wonder how many African Americans are watching this movie right now. And it brings up the issue, was this a segregated theater? And chances are it was at the time. And so you go well beyond this picture by asking intelligent questions. Fashion, what are they wearing? How is that important? Design. And they have a radio. Let's talk about the history of radio, the history of mass media, history of advertising, architecture. Someone had to build this. It's about the landscape, the alteration of the landscape. Talk about fast food. They have snack bars there. Drive-through. I had a student that did a history of the drive-through window, and I was amazed. It goes back to the 30s. Something I could have been with certain, I would never thought about it. And they came up with a very interesting thing based on a picture like this. Photography was a picture. What's the history of photography? How would life be different if we did not have photography? And for all of you who are watching this, if I was in a room with you, I would be entertaining at this point and give me some ideas and suggestions that you would connect with. So I think this is a very interesting exercise. You can do this with a movie clip, with a song clip, with text. We do face accessibility issues, rightly so. So you want to present assignments like this that are in alternate types of formats, and reading a source document, reading a chapter, and asking these kinds of questions is good. Okay, we're near the very end of this, and we kind of started where we began with stories. We tell stories. And Godard, who's one of my favorite film directors, he's still alive, by the way, at least at the time I'm doing this presentation, he's alive. I learned what he has to say about it. He's talking about the process of making movies. A story should have a beginning, a middle, and end, but not necessarily in that order. And I totally agree with that. When we study history, I do think that it is perfectly valid to talk about history as a story with a definite beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is the narrative part, the linear narrative that we started with. But if you just stay there, you miss so much. Because I started, with the story of my motel, and it had a beginning. I didn't talk about that, but the story of the motel I started with is occurring right now. I was talking about how I think back at that. So I started at the end. Who I am right now because I lived there. I didn't start at the first and do a narration of my life. I was in first grade. I went through the fifth grade. I did this and that because that is, to me, is not what history is. So I think we should think about history like this. It should have a beginning, middle, and end, but you don't have to start there. You can start with the end, and you can rewind and go back to somewhere else. So this is a quote I want to leave you with as we think about another book that I use a lot in my class over fire, the Herald and Purple Crayon. Lots of videos about this. I tell students, and some of you are probably familiar with this. This is like one of those, over thing. What do you think about? I think about my grandchildren and all the stuff that I have right now, and all that kind of interaction I have and connections I have. But this book is something that every student should read because every person that teaches class should read. It's about a little boy who has a crayon that creates the world around him. And I tell students their projects, their discussions, their class participation, I'm giving them a crayon. They can give it any color they want to give it. And their job is to create a world around them. And that is what my class is all about. It's about finding those webs of possibilities that I think we're supposed to talk about in just a second. So this is probably the most important book you can use in your class. And then I would encourage you, this is not an ad because I don't have any financial stake in Google, but if you have never used Google Arts and Culture, this is the best textbook I know of. And I would encourage you to use it because it really highlights many of the things I've talked about making connections, about seeing history's webs of possibilities. And it's very exciting. I assume that most of you have seen it, but I would use it often. So it's been a pleasure to be with you today. I look forward to our actual conference when we may have a chance to do some questions and answers. So I just want you to, that's your homework assignment. It's to make the covert and overt connections with the world around you and get out your crayon and create the world. So thank you very, very much.